you ever felt it? That shift in the air, the veil between worlds thinning? Ever wonder why some things seem magnified late at night? Sounds of footsteps, scraping nails on the walls, and even whispers in the dark. For centuries, often around midnight or 3 a.m., it has been whispered about as a time of heightened spiritual activity. A time when magic is real and the unseen world draws closer. The legends, the lore, the terrifying stories that haunt the night. So join us as we embrace the darkness and explore the magic, the madness, and the mystery of the witching hour. Be sure to rate us and subscribe to the show so you never miss a tale from beyond the walls of sleep. Welcome back, Wanderers of the Liminal.
Welcome back. You've stumbled into another chapter of the Dreamscape Chronicles, where we tug at the threads of the unseen until the tapestry either reveals a pattern or it unravels into something beautifully strange. Tonight we're entering a territory that's fascinated, alarmed, and perplexed humanity across continents and centuries. Baleful magic, the curses, hexes, maledictions, and mutterings that societies have whispered about for millennia. Now, before anyone clutches their pearls, or their protective amulets, this episode isn't a tutorial nor a manifesto. We're here excavating the history, the psychology, the spiritual philosophy, and most importantly, the duality behind these practices. Because, like all things in the occult, the shadow is rarely just a shadow.
Exactly. And part of the misunderstanding comes from the assumption that anything labeled baleful is automatically synonymous with malicious. But historically, magical practices coded as harmful were often used for justice, protection, boundary setting, or settling disputes when no other systems of recourse existed. They were, in some cultures, as much a part of spiritual governance as prayer or ritual cleansing. Tonight, we'll sift through thousands of years of belief: Mesopotamian curse tablets, Egyptian execration rituals, Greek judicial bindings, and European maledictions, without dramatizing them or sanitizing them. Just meeting them where they lived, in the human need to understand why harm occurs and how intention shapes consequence.
And that's only the first layer, because once we've established what baleful magic has historically been, we're diving headfirst into karmic return. Theosophical interpretations of moral cause and effect, and the famous or infamous threefold law. These concepts shape how modern practitioners, scholars, and skeptics alike interpret magical ethics. And yes, for those ready to pounce, the threefold law is a relatively modern esoteric idea. Gardner, Valiente, and earlier Wiccan writers gave it shape, not ancient grimoires. Meanwhile, ceremonial magic traditions had their own frameworks, more rooted in intention and energetic alignment than moral reward or punishment.
And then comes the heart of tonight's exploration, the duality. Not just good versus bad, but harm versus protection, justice versus vengeance, cosmic consequence versus psychological projection, and how ethics shift depending on worldview, culture, and cosmology. Because a curse in one region might be considered a protective boundary in another. A binding might be viewed as harmful or as a spiritual seatbelt. It depends on the society, the circumstance, and the cosmological structure people believed governed their reality.
We'll also examine the philosophical side. Think Eliphas Levi's framing of constructive and destructive currents, Blavatsky's karmic causality, and the deeper Hermetic idea that intention is the true axis of moral movement, not the symbol or ritual. No prescriptions, no instructions, just an open conversation about how belief systems create frameworks for understanding human conflict, emotion, and agency.
So settle in. Let the room dim a little. Let the atmosphere settle around you. We're heading into a realm where curses aren't simply threats in the night, but cultural artifacts, philosophical puzzles, and reflections of what societies fear. and what they hope will set things right.
And more importantly, we're looking at how something historically labeled baleful can carry within it both darkness and the light. Because duality isn't just a theme tonight, it's the structure, the mirror, the hinge on which the entire concept turns. So before we venture further into the labyrinth, we need to pause and do something terribly unmagical. Define our terms. Baleful magic is a wonderfully dramatic phrase, but historically and anthropologically, it's an umbrella covering a wide range of practices and beliefs. And as a good scholar or any slightly pedantic occultist will tell you, precision matters. In anthropology, baleful magic often refers to intentional acts meant to cause misfortune, whether through symbolic action, invocation of spiritual forces, or the targeted focus of will. James Frazier in The Golden Bough famously frames this as sympathetic magic. Like produces like, though Frazier oversimplifies. He gives us the basic idea. People believed actions performed in a symbolic sphere could shape events in the lived world.
And if we broaden that definition culturally, we see something even more interesting. Baleful magic wasn't always a rogue operation. In ancient civilizations, it could be formal, sanctioned, and woven into religious or legal life. Take Mesopotamia. Curse formulas appear in temple inscriptions, land contracts, and even royal decrees. They weren't just ominous warnings, they served as protective measures and legal deterrents. The logic was straightforward. If someone violated the agreement, divine or spiritual agents would enforce the consequences. Or look at ancient Egypt, where execration rituals were used not only against enemies of the state, but also as symbolic purification, a resetting of cosmic order. Egyptologists describe these rites as reinforcing Mat, the principle of harmony and justice, not exactly casual malevolence.
And that theme repeats throughout history. In Greco-Roman contexts, the Defixiones, the cursed tablets you find across the Mediterranean, weren't chaotic malice. Christopher Faraone and John Geiger point out that many were judicial in nature, petitions to chthonic deities asking for justice in disputes, love rivals, legal opponents, business competitors. The tablets weren't the magical equivalent of lashing out. They were ways of appealing to the spiritual court when the earthly one felt insufficient. There's something fascinating about that, isn't there? Baleful magic as a form of spiritual arbitration, a method of addressing grievances in societies where recourse wasn't always accessible or impartial.
It's a recurring motif everywhere you look. Among the Azande of Central Africa, described in Evans Pritchard's classic Ethnography, witchcraft wasn't merely personal hostility. It explained misfortune within a moral framework. Someone's envy or ill will could manifest through spiritual means. But the focus wasn't on punishment, it was on restoring balance. Divination intervened to diagnose the issue, and ritual helped realign things. Even in European folk traditions, often distorted by later sensationalism, cursing practices weren't always expressions of malice. Sometimes they were seen as responses to injustice or protective maneuvers against harm, spiritual or social. Carlo Ginzburg's work on Benandanti and folk cosmologies shows how blurry the line was between harmful and protective magic.
So if we step back from the tar black aesthetic often associated with the word curse, what we really have is a spectrum, a continuum, a set of symbolic acts situated within cultural systems that assign meaning to misfortune, conflict, and moral consequences. Let's spell this out a little bit. Baleful magic historically included curses and maledictions, which were spoken, written, or inscribed, bindings and restraints, symbolic limitations placed on someone, direct misfortune through ritual or invocation, spiritual petitions for justice or redress, enlisting spirits, ancestors, or deities to intervene, In some cultures, witchcraft accusations tied to envy, social tension, or broken norms. But these weren't always understood as evil acts. Sometimes they were seen as legitimate channels for addressing harm.
Exactly. And that brings us to something crucial. Societies didn't all use the same moral framework. What one group saw as an act of aggression, another might have seen as defense or justice. And sometimes both were true simultaneously. For example, Mediterranean belief in the evil eye isn't just about envy harming someone. It's also about protection, communal ethics, and acknowledging the power of social emotion. You can't separate the harmful potential from the protective remedies because culturally, they're two halves of the same concept. And if we pull this into the broader theme of tonight's episode, the duality, we begin to see that baleful magic sits in a kind of moral twilight zone. Not because it's gray magic, but because its meaning depends entirely on the cultural, spiritual, and personal context in which it exists.
Which is exactly why we're spending so much time grounding the concept before leaping into karma, return, or modern occult interpretations. If we don't understand what baleful magic has meant historically, then any discussion about moral consequence becomes untethered. So let's hold on to those definitions. Baleful magic is any symbolic or ritual act intended to bring misfortune, restriction, or pressure upon a person or situation. However, its moral value has always been defined by intent, cultural norms, and spiritual worldview, not by the act itself.
And with that foundation, we're ready to cross the threshold into the philosophical side. Karma, return, esoteric ethics, and how different traditions interpret the consequences, spiritual or energetic, of directing harmful intention. But before we get cosmic with it, we need to take one more step, tracing the origins of these practices through ancient civilizations and folk traditions in a little more detail. Because knowing where baleful magic comes from helps us understand why it's never been as simple as good or bad.
Okay, so to understand the duality of baleful magic, we need to travel back to the earliest civilizations, places where writing, ritual, and the law were inseparable. In these cultures, baleful magic wasn't an underground operation or a dark hobby. It was built into the architecture of spiritual and political life. Take ancient Mesopotamia. Some of the oldest written curses appear carved into temple foundations, boundary stones, and legal tablets. These inscriptions weren't emotional outbursts, they were formalized protections. If someone violated a contract, tampered with a property line, or defied a decree, the curse invoked divine forces to enforce consequences. In essence, if human justice faltered, spiritual justice stepped in.
And then there's ancient Egypt, where execration rituals, breaking clay figures or pots inscribed with names of enemies, served as a kind of spiritual maintenance. These rituals weren't reckless displays of harm. They upheld cosmic order. Egyptians saw the world as balanced between harmony and chaos, so symbolically, neutralizing threats helped maintain that balance. Baleful magic there wasn't malicious. It was preventative. It was civic. It was cosmic housekeeping.
Now, in the ancient Near East, curses show up in treaties and diplomatic agreements. These documents didn't rely solely on the honor of kings, they called upon gods to witness and enforce obligations. Breaking an oath meant confronting spiritual repercussions, not just political fallout.
Then we arrive in the Greco-Roman world, home of the famous lead curse tablets, Depicciones. These sheets of lead bear inscriptions asking underworld spirits or deities to intervene in disputes, legal cases, business rivalries, athletic competitions, and romantic conflicts. These weren't wild acts of hostility. They were petitions, formal appeals to divine powers when mortal systems seemed insufficient. Magic was another avenue in the quest for justice, not simply an instrument of vindictiveness.
And as we move forward, the lines between religious practice, folk belief, and sorcery blur even more. The Greco-Egyptian magical papyri demonstrated that rituals invoking harm or restraint weren't fringe. They existed alongside prayers, healing spells, and protections. Again, it's not about good or evil. It's about utility, context, and cosmic negotiation. Now, shifting from the ancient world into later folk and diasporic traditions, we see Baleful magic take on a whole new layer: pragmatic, protective, and linked to survival. Let's start with hoodoo, a system deeply rooted in the experience of enslaved and marginalized communities in the American South. Here, practices that outsiders often labeled curses were often about protection, justice, or balancing the scales when official systems offered no remedy. Symbolic acts, whether using personal concerns, written petitions, or ritual language, could be directed towards halting harm, reversing wrongdoing, or setting boundaries with those who caused harm. In many cases, Baleful magic was a form of empowerment in the environment where conventional recourse was unavailable.
Then there's Haitian voodoo, where spiritual intervention, whether benevolent or baleful, exists within a coherent cosmology of spirits, ancestors, and community. Harmful magic, real or perceived, is addressed through counteraction, negotiation, and ritual. The spiritual world is not separate from daily life. It participates in resolving disputes and restoring equilibrium. And importantly, what outsiders sometimes call cursing can, with voodoo cosmology, be part of balancing a disrupted relationship, protecting the vulnerable, or addressing injustices that have not been acknowledged or resolved.
In both hoodoo and voodoo, harmful and protective practices share tools, symbols, and spiritual intermediaries. The distinction lies in intention and circumstance, not in the outward form. Baleful magic is not an ethical category. It's a response category, a way of addressing the problem.
Another tradition often misunderstood and often misrepresented is that of Romani magical practices. Historically, Romani communities developed systems of spiritual protection, blessing, boundary setting, and occasionally symbolic retribution. Outsiders have long sensationalized these traditions, turning them into caricatures or stereotypes, but the reality is far more nuanced. Within Romani communities, certain ritual acts that outsiders might label curses often function as social mechanisms, affirming boundaries, signaling moral violations, or invoking ancestral or spiritual forces to witness wrongdoing. These acts weren't expressions of chaotic malice, but responses to harmful behavior, broken trust, or community threats. And importantly, Romani traditions emphasize reciprocity. Actions carry consequences, and spiritual gestures carry responsibility. Harmful intent isn't executed lightly. It sits within a system of ethical understanding and communal identity. Baleful magic here, again, isn't a rogue operation. It's part of a cultural structure that maintains relationships, protects members, and reinforces moral expectations.
If we move into broader European folk magic, we find similar patterns across regions, whether rural Britain, the Balkans, or the Iberian Peninsula. People used charms, spoke formulas, symbolic acts, and ritualized petitions not only to heal and bless, but also to constrain, stop, and redirect harmful forces. Bindings might prevent a thief from continuing their wrongdoings. A symbolic act might halt someone from spreading slander. A malediction might be invoked against someone who violates a sacred oath. The same tools used for healing could, in different hands, be turned towards restraint, which tells us something crucial. The boundary between harmful and protective magic has never been fixed. In many traditions, it's a matter of aim, not method. A protective charm for livestock might involve the same ritual structure as a formula to hinder someone with ill intent. A blessing could be reversed into a restriction with a shift of intention. Again, the duality emerges. Magic isn't categorized by type, it's categorized by purpose.
So across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Near East, diasporic traditions like hoodoo and voodoo, Romani spiritual practice, and European folk magic, the message is consistent. Baleful magic historically functioned as justice, protection, boundary setting, or conflict resolution. It wasn't inherently malicious, it was situational, it was contextual, it was meaningful within each culture's worldview.
And this is the perfect transition point into what comes next: karmic return, esoteric consequences, and the modern interpretations of magical ethics. Because when we talk about return, whether karmic, symbolic, or psychological, we have to understand that historically, harmful magic wasn't always framed as morally wrong, which makes the conversation about consequence vastly more interesting. Okay, dreamers, so before we dive into the threefold law or magical rebound, we should zoom out and talk about karma. Not the pop culture version where dropping your coffee means you did something wrong in a past life. We're talking about the philosophical framework that actually underlies the concept: karma as action and consequence, a moral architecture that predates modern occult thinking by thousands of years. In its classical context across Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions, karma isn't a cosmic punishment. It's the principle that all actions, intentions, and choices produce effects, some immediate and some unfolding across time. Karma isn't vindictive, it's neutral, like gravity. What goes up must come down.
Exactly.
I mean, that's just facts. That's the way it works.
And gravity's not being mean. Karma is often described as cause and effect, but that's almost too simplified. Traditional teachings emphasize intention, the inner motive behind an action, not just the action itself. Two identical actions with different motivations could generate very different karmic results. There's also a long-term dimension to karma. Some effects are immediate, some accumulate, and some shape patterns across lifetimes in certain philosophical systems. The key thing here is karma is not a divine reward or punishment. It's a natural law of moral momentum.
Fast forward to Western esoteric traditions, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when theosophy and occult revival movements adopted the idea of karma. They reframed it, streamlined it, you could say. In these systems, karma became a way to explain spiritual accountability. The idea that every action produces a reverberation in a subtle, energetic, and spiritual layer of existence. Instead of focusing on cycles of rebirth or liberation, Western occult groups used karma to describe metaphysics of consequence within a magical framework.
It becomes less about religious doctrine and more about ethics. For many occultists, karma is a philosophical backbone, a reminder that what you send out shapes your spiritual trajectory. But again, it's not framed as punishment. It's a conversation between your intention, your action, and the universe's natural balancing mechanisms. This becomes especially important when we talk about baleful magic, because intention, motivation, purpose, is central in determining the karmic weight of a magical act.
Which brings us to the Wiccan threefold law, a modern concept inspired by earlier occult philosophy, but not identical to traditional karma. It emerged in the mid-20th century through witchcraft and suggests that whatever you put into the world energetically, magically, or morally returns to you threefold. The threefold part isn't literal math, it's symbolic. It means the consequences of your actions are magnified, so you're encouraged to be intentional and mindful, not a dick.
Right. And historically, the threefold law wasn't meant to be a looming threat. It was a teaching tool, a way to emphasize ethical responsibility. It highlighted the idea that magical practice isn't separate from personal integrity. If karma describes a kind of universal moral physics, the threefold law is like a house rule within Wicca. a system built to encourage ethical alignment, self-awareness, and accountability.
Now, let's talk about the return, or rebound. The idea that magical workings can come back to the caster. Different esoteric traditions interpret this in many different ways, but there's a common thread. Magic is an interaction, not a one-way projection. Some interpretations view return as a psychological mechanism. You send out an intention, and your own subconscious responds in a way that reinforces the emotion or mental state behind it.
Others frame it as energetic, that you're working within a web of interconnected forces, so any disturbance you create ripples back through the system and eventually reaches you. And in yet other traditions, return is symbolic, a moral reminder that you're part of a spiritual ecosystem where actions have weight. None of these models require a punitive universe. They all emphasize balance, interconnection, and responsibility. Return is a reminder that your actions, magical or mundane, don't exist in a vacuum.
So let's think about this through some ethics of defensive versus offensive, right? This is where things become interesting. Not all magical harm is equal. In many historical systems, using magic to protect yourself or your community was not considered immoral. A protective binding, a counteraction, or a reversal was often a morally just response to harm.
But intentionally causing suffering for personal gain? Different story. Most magical traditions apply a very different ethical lens to protection versus aggression. And intention again becomes the core factor. If you're responding to genuine harm, physical, emotional, spiritual, or social, many systems regard that as balancing the scales rather than tipping them.
So when we talk about karmic consequence or return in relation to baleful magic, the framework isn't all malefic magic is bad. It's why are you doing this? What energy, intention, or necessity is behind it? A defensive act in many systems carries a very different karmic implication than an unprovoked assault. So kind of like, fuck around and find out.
I suppose so. So, why do these concepts matter to our topic, right? Really, understanding karma, the threefold law, and return is essential because they reveal something fundamental about duality of baleful magic. Magic doesn't carry morality on its own. The practitioner does. These frameworks aren't meant to scare people out of using magic. They're meant to guide thoughtfulness, to make the practitioner consider consequences, not in a fear-based way, but in an intentional, self-aware way. And they offer a way to think about harm that doesn't rely on modern moral panic or sensationalism. They show us that throughout history, cultures have used different systems to determine when magic is justified, when it's reckless, and when it's necessary. Karma and return aren't cosmic punishments. They're metaphors, systems, and spiritual philosophies designed to encourage awareness of our actions and their ripples.
Now, when people hear the word curse, they tend to imagine an act of pure hostility, something done to torment or punish. But if we look at how many cultures actually handled harm-oriented magic, we see a very different pattern. These practices often developed as tools for defense, not aggression. In parts of the Mediterranean, for instance, certain ritual appeals were designed to stop threats. Someone causing misfortune, someone who violated trust, or someone who believed to be manipulating spiritual forces improperly. These workings weren't framed as attacks. They were seen as a way of restoring stability in the world where misalignment had occurred. In Jewish ritual and mystical traditions, there were practices intended to neutralize harmful influences or protect communities from spiritual danger. They were performed casually. They were used in moments of genuine concern or ethical crisis, where action was needed to shield oneself or one's community. And in Middle Eastern folk magic, ritual restrictions or spiritual directed admonitions were sometimes permitted when a wrong had been gone unaddressed, or when an individual was endangered. These weren't casual harm spells, they were structured responses in situations where protection required more than symbolic gesture. Across these traditions, what an outsider might label as harmful was often a form of intervention when conventional options weren't sufficient.
And what counts as harm versus protection depends a lot on cultural framing. In one tradition, stopping someone's harmful behavior with a ritual boundary is considered responsible. In another, the same act might be labeled aggressive. This fluidity shows up across esoteric literature too. Many systems interpret actions directed toward an aggressor as corrective rather than punitive. If a ritual prevents further damage, it's not viewed as cruelty. It's seen as maintaining equilibrium. Even when the mechanics look forceful, the intention behind them is often firmly rooted in restoration, not domination. It's about re-establishing right order, not unleashing chaos. So the distinction between curse and protection isn't about the technique. It's about how the action functions within a culture's moral and spiritual framework.
This leads naturally into a larger philosophical question. Is a harmful magical action inherently immoral, or does morality depend on the practitioner's purpose? Occult philosophy often approaches this through the lens of polarity. Instead of classifying actions as good or evil, many esoteric systems treat them as movements along different energetic vectors. Eliphas Levi described this in terms of opposing astral streams, some oriented towards dissolution, others towards cohesion. Neither stream is morally coded on its own. The practitioner determines how it is used. This perspective suggests that the ethical dimension of magic doesn't come from the act, but from the will directing it, which makes moral evaluation more nuanced than a simple harm is bad, healing is good dichotomy.
When occultists talk about magical ethics, they often break it down through several lenses. Intention, not just what action is taken, but the motive behind it. Context, the conditions in which the action is being performed. Responsibility, awareness of the consequences one might set in motion. And energetic implications, the way actions shape a practitioner's internal state, not just external outcomes. Modern practitioners navigate this landscape in different ways. Some follow ethical guidelines passed through magical lineages, others rely on foundational texts from their tradition, and many build personal philosophies shaped by the systems they practice and the experiences they've had. What's consistent is that practitioners aren't encouraged to avoid power. They're encouraged to understand what their power does and how it shapes who they become.
Okay, now, so in contemporary magic, different schools approach these questions in very distinct ways. Chaos magic, for example, treats ethical systems as frameworks that practitioners can choose, modify, or discard based on utility. Ethics aren't handed down from an external authority. They're crafted by the magician to match their worldviews, psychological patterns, and desired outcomes. This doesn't mean chaos magicians operate without ethics. It means they decide which ethical architecture best supports their work. If a baneful act disrupts a practitioner's internal landscape or contradicts their chosen identity, the conflict itself becomes the cost. Chaos magic puts the practitioner at the center of the equation, making ethical inquiry a personal responsibility rather than a universal rule.
Hermetic systems take a different approach entirely. In classical Hermetic philosophy, the universe is structured by correspondence and harmony. Actions that work against that harmony generate consequences not because they're wrong, but because they interfere with natural alignment. So, a Hermetic practitioner might view a restrictive or baleful act as justified if it restores balance that has been disrupted. If it throws the system further out of alignment, it becomes problematic, not morally, but cosmologically. And then there's Thelema, where everything revolves around the concept of true will. Instead of asking, is this harmful? A Thelemite asks, is this action an authentic expression of my deepest purpose? If the act is reactive, driven by fear, insecurity, or ego, it moves the practitioner away from their true will. If the act supports their spiritual trajectory, it's considered aligned. Here, the ethical question is internal, not external.
What's compelling is that even though these traditions differ, they all arrive at the same conclusion. Baleful magic isn't inherently immoral. Its ethical dimensions depend on the practitioner's intent, the circumstances, and the alignment between action and inner structure. Chaos magic emphasizes self-authorship. Hermeticism emphasizes cosmic balance. Thelema emphasizes alignment with the true will. Each system provides a different lens, but all treat morality as something more complex than simply labeling actions baneful or benevolent. The duality of baleful magic ultimately reflects the duality within the practitioner themselves, their boundaries, their beliefs, and their relationship to power. When we talk about the duality of baleful magic today, we're no longer confined to a single lineage or worldview. Contemporary occultism is a crossroad. Hermeticism overlaps with Thelema, which overlaps with chaos magic, which intersects with folk traditions, mystical philosophies, and psychological models of magical consciousness. It's a mosaic, not a monolith. One thing modern practitioners tend to share, though, is a shift away from automatic moral labeling. Instead of filing actions into benevolent or malicious, they evaluate them through the structure of intent, clarity, and consequence. Chaos magicians are especially direct about this. For them, the working only has meaning if it coheres with personal symbolism or chosen belief structures. A baneful act isn't classified as dark. It's assessed on whether the practitioner understands what they're influencing and why. In that sense, the chaos magic treats these workings as psychological vectors. They're tools for shaping identity, reclaiming agency, or disrupting an internal pattern long before they're interpreted as forces acting outward. Baleful symbolism becomes a mirror rather than a weapon.
Hermetic thought introduces a different tone, less psychological, more structural. Its emphasis on principles like polarity, correspondence, and rhythm reframes magical influence as participation in natural processes. A working that appears harsh isn't automatically unethical. It may be a symbolic attempt to correct imbalance or clear stagnation. In Hermetic contexts, disruption can be constructive. Banishing, severing, binding, and dissolving are all seen as part of the same continuum as healing or energizing. The ethical question isn't about the color of the act, but whether its application is aligned with comprehension of universal processes. Thelema adds yet another dimension by grounding moral evaluation in the concept of true will. Instead of focusing on societal approval or cosmic reward, Thelemites ask whether an action emerges from authentic inner direction or from reactive emotion. A working can appear aggressive, but still be in harmony with one's true will if it removes obstruction, breaks illusion, or clears a path for growth. Malice, on the other hand, is seen as misalignment, an obscuring of purpose rather than an expression of it.
Beyond those systems, mystical and esoteric traditions further complicate this picture. In Kabbalistic interpretations, for example, restrictive or severe forces aren't considered negative but necessary counterbalancing aspects of creation. Severity, or gevura, is part of maintaining order. This allows for practices that symbolically cut, restrict, or repel without implying wrongdoing. In various forms of esoteric Buddhism and Taoist magic, forceful rites may be used to disperse harmful influence, subdue chaotic energies, or dismantle illusions. These aren't framed as acts of aggressions, they're framed as restoring harmony. In Sufi esotericism, the distinction between cleansing force and harmful force often lies in intention and inner sincerity rather than the outward form of the action. Across these mystical systems, the common thread is that forceful magic isn't automatically considered destructive. It can be corrective, clarifying, or boundary setting.
When we step into modern magical practice broadly, ceremonial, folk, chaos, hermetic, thelemic, mystic, the takeaway becomes surprisingly unified. Intent alone isn't sufficient to define ethics, and outward form doesn't reveal inner purpose. A protective working may use fierce symbolism, while a seemingly benign charm could be fueled by resentment or fear. Modern practitioners often develop personal ethical structures based on lineage teachings, spiritual mentors, meditative insight, or philosophical study. Some rely on mystical models of inner alignment. Others take a psychological approach rooted in shadow integration. Some look to cosmic principles, others to ancestral belief systems. Across all these viewpoints, the duality of baleful magic becomes less about good versus evil and more about coherence versus contradiction. Does the working support one's growth, clarity, and authenticity, or does it reinforce turmoil and fixation? The question becomes not, is this act dark, but what part of the self is acting through this, and what reality will it create?
And that's where modern practitioners, regardless of the system, tend to converge. Baleful and protective magic aren't opposites. They're expressions of how the practitioner chooses to navigate conflict, transformation, boundaries, and personal evolution. Whether someone stands in the current of chaos magic, the geometry of Hermeticism, the sovereignty of Thelema, and the mysticism of Kabbalah, the discipline of Eastern esoteric arts, or a woven blend of many traditions, the ethical conversation remains internal, intentional, and deeply reflective. In this contemporary landscape, duality isn't a moral verdict. It's a structural observation. And for many practitioners, it's in that tension between force and restraint, disillusion and protection, shadow and clarity, where magic and their identity truly takes form.
If we're going to talk about the duality of baleful forces, we can't skip one of the oldest and most persistent concepts in magical thought, the evil eye. It's one of those ideas that shows up everywhere, so widely distributed across time and geography that anthropologists still debate whether it's spread through cultural contact or emerged independently in different societies. At its core, the evil eye is the belief that envy, resentment, or even unintentional admiration can project harmful influence. A glance, not a ritual, not an invocation, not a crafted tool, just a look that carries too much intensity. In regions ranging from the Mediterranean to the Middle East, South Asia, the Balkans, and the Americas, the core idea is remarkably consistent. Excess attention can drain vitality or disrupt fortune. What makes the evil eye unique among esoteric concepts is how it blurs the line between curse and condition. It isn't always deliberate malice. In many traditions, the person casting it might not even know what they're doing. And that ambiguity is what gives it so much staying power. The evil eye doesn't operate like a spell. It's more like a force of imbalance triggered by emotional tension. Many cultures describe it as a kind of psychic pressure, an unwanted exchange of energy that destabilizes the recipient. Because of this, it functions as both a social warning and a supernatural threat. It tells communities, watch how you look at each other, and watch how you're being looked at. Across cultures, the evil eye can manifest as misfortune, sudden fatigue, unexplained illness, or generalized disruption. In some traditions, children are seen as especially vulnerable because they draw attention more easily. Animals, crops, craftsmanship, and even wealth can be susceptible. Anything that might evoke envy is considered at risk.
The fascinating part is how the evil eye exists simultaneously as a curse and a protective system. On one side, you have the harmful force, envy, ill will, or unconscious projections. On the other, you have an enormous architecture of protections built in to counteract it. Take the Mediterranean, for instance. Amulets like the blue-eyed bead Nazar, The hand-shaped charms, hamsa, and written talismans have been used for centuries as shields, but these aren't just decorative symbols, they're expressions of community awareness. They acknowledge that human emotion has impact, that not all harm is intentional, and that protection can be woven into daily life. In some Jewish folk traditions, protective gestures or incantations were used to avert the evil eye, especially during life events that attracted attention. Births, weddings, new ventures. These weren't framed as high magic, they were ordinary acts of safeguarding, acknowledging that vulnerability increases when others focus on you.
In South Asian cultures, the evil eye takes on even broader interpretations. It might be countered with burned herbs, soot markings, or symbolically dirtying an object to reduce its attractiveness. Here again, we see the duality. The cause is harmful, but the response is protective. The problem isn't only envy, but visibility, being seen too brightly, too openly, too triumphantly. Some traditions emphasize that the evil eye isn't about punishment or intentional malice. It's about imbalance, created by excessive admiration or unguarded praise. Compliments can be considered dangerous unless they're softened with protective phrases. It's not the look itself that harms, but the energetic weight behind it.
What makes the evil eye particularly compelling in occult philosophy is that it doesn't rely on a moral dichotomy. It's not the same as a curse cast with deliberate intention. Instead, it represents a kind of unconscious projection. Envy as a force, attention as a current, and focus as the conduit. Even in modern esoteric circles, practitioners view the evil eye as a lesson in energetic boundaries. It raises questions about exposure, vulnerability, and the subtle effects of social dynamics. Some interpret it through psychological frameworks, the idea that envy, whether received or given, can destabilize emotion and motivation. Others interpret it metaphysically as an exchange of subtle forces that require counterbalance, and in that interpretation, the evil eye becomes a perfect example of duality in magic thought. It can be harmful, but the systems built around it are protective. It represents both the fragility of fortune and the resilience of community. It's a reminder that not all danger is intentional, not all protection is confrontational, and not all magic requires ritual formality. For many practitioners today, the evil eye symbolizes the blurred boundaries between personal energy and social influence. Whether it's worn as a charm, acknowledged symbolically, or explored through psychological introspection, it stands as one of the rare magical concepts that bridges ancient superstitions, cultural identity, and modern metaphysical thought. So now in modern media, it has done something interesting with Baleful magic. It's turned a nuanced collection of traditions, beliefs, and esoteric philosophies into a set of visual tropes. Curses, hexes, jinxes. They're often presented as either instant acts of destruction or dramatic gestures of theatrical malevolence. It's effective for storytelling, but it collapses centuries of complexity into something that fits neatly into a plot. Many movies and series portray Baleful magic as an almost biological weapon, one thrown casually, usually by the villain, to heighten tension or thin out the supporting cast. The problem with that depiction isn't just accuracy, it's that it reinforces the idea that these practices exist solely to cause suffering. In reality, many historical and modern systems treat forceful magic as context-based, symbolic correction, boundary setting, or spiritual hygiene, not the metaphysical version of a missile launcher.
There's also a recurring motif where curses are shown as irreversible, absolute, and disconnected from intent. Once cast, the victim spirals helplessly, and the caster becomes the embodiment of darkness. In most genuine traditions, even the harsher forms of magic exist within a framework: ethical, spiritual, karmic, or communal. Intent matters. Consequence matters. Balance matters. Another issue is how media frequently conflates different traditions, combining them into a single aesthetic. A folk charm, a ceremonial invocation, and a cultural evil eye motif might all appear in the same scene, rebranded as interchangeable dark magic. It may look atmospheric, but it strips these elements of their cultural meanings and reduces them to props. And perhaps the biggest misconception, the idea that practitioners who engage with the shadow side of magic must be morally corrupt. In reality, most people working with heavy symbolism or defensive aggression are exploring boundaries, healing trauma, or confronting internal patterns. They're not plotting cinematic revenge arcs.
When you strip away that dramatization, the superstition, and the storytelling exaggeration, Baleful magic becomes something far more human. It's a language, one that cultures across the world develop to navigate conflict, protection, vulnerability, fear, and change. The duality we've explored throughout this episode isn't the clash between good and evil. It's the reflection of how humans understand power. Baleful symbolism can warn, defend, correct, or confront. It can express fear or agency. It can protect a boundary or challenge a violation. The meaning isn't in the tool, it's in the intent, the context, and the inner alignment of the practitioner.
You know, it kind of reminds me of like a hammer. You can use it to nail up something to build something, or you can use it to hit somebody over the head with it. The hammer's not evil. Hammer's not moral.
I totally thought you were going to say to take something apart, but okay.
Well, I mean... And that's the real core.
Intent, people.
Duality isn't a flaw in magical systems. It's the foundation. The same force that can wound can also protect. The same symbolism that can unsettle can empower. Traditions around the world recognize this long before modern media created its simplified tropes. When we understand this spectrum, protective, corrective, destructive, restorative, we see that baleful magic isn't inherently dark. It's a response, a reflection, and sometimes a reckoning. And like all things in the occult, it demands intention, awareness, and a willingness to confront the shadows that shape us.
Well, I think that brings us full circle. We've traced baleful magic from ancient protective rites to modern interpretive frameworks, wandered through the maze of cultural symbolism, and untangled how intention shapes perception. What started as fear as a harmful glance or a whispered curse eventually became an entire spectrum of practices. Some fierce, some subtle, some deeply psychological, some profoundly spiritual. Baleful magic, at its core, isn't about destruction. It's about understanding the forces we carry, the boundaries we maintain, and the shadows we inevitably confront. And when we see it that way, it becomes less of a forbidden subject and more of a mirror, reflecting how humans manage conflict, vulnerability, and the desire to shape the unseen currents of their lives.
What's interesting is how, after traveling through so many traditions and systems tonight, the pattern that emerges is one of responsibility rather than fear. Whether a practice is protective, corrective, or forceful, it always seems to come back to awareness. Awareness of self, of intention, of consequence. It's a reminder that power in any form is a relationship. You're never acting in isolation, even if the work happens in silence and shadow. And that's what makes these discussions meaningful. When we strip away sensationalism, we're left with the human heart of magic. How we protect ourselves, how we set boundaries, how we respond to harm, and how we define integrity on our own terms. Duality isn't a contradiction. It's the very thing that gives these practices their depth.
So as we close out tonight's exploration of curses, protections, karmic currents, and the long lineage of symbolic force, we hope you're leaving with more questions than answers in the best possible way. The kind of questions that stay with you, drift into your dreams, and whisper at the edges of your thought long after the episode ends, because that's where the real magic always begins.
Until next time, dreamers, keep dreaming and
join us in discovering what may lie beyond the walls of sleep.